September 12, 1945. Saipan, Northern Mariana Islands. Corporal James Williams stood at his forward post, rifle resting against his shoulder, scanning the jungle tree line 200 yards out. Dawn mist clung to the undergrowth like smoke. Then he saw movement figures breaking through the foliage, stumbling over roots, running not away from the American perimeter but straight toward it. His finger moved toward the trigger. Every instinct screamed threat. Before we continue with this extraordinary moment, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, whether it's Tokyo, Iowa, or anywhere in between. We're building a global community of history lovers who believe these stories deserve to be remembered, and your support keeps these forgotten moments alive. Williams' training kicked in. The other sentries raised their weapons. Standard protocol when unidentified figures approached the wire, but something felt wrong. The shapes moved differently, smaller frames, different silhouettes. Behind them, muzzle flashes lit up the jungle darkness as Japanese rifles fired at these fleeing figures. Williams' throat tightened. He shouted 3 words that would save 37 lives that morning. "Don't shoot. They're women." And in that frozen moment between war and peace, between enemy and human being, everyone present realized that everything they had been taught about surrender, about honor, about the enemy, all of it was about to be challenged by the simplest act of running toward help instead of accepting death. The Battle of Saipan had officially ended on July 9, 1944. Over 3 weeks of brutal combat left 3,000 Americans dead and 13,000 wounded. Japanese losses were catastrophic: 25,000 soldiers killed, another 5,000 civilians dead, many by suicide at places like Marby Point, where families jumped from cliffs rather than surrender. Only 1,800 Japanese soldiers became prisoners. The propaganda had been that effective. Surrender meant torture, humiliation, death. Better to die by your own hand than fall into enemy hands. But the battle's end did not mean the fighting stopped. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers melted into Saipan's jungle interior. They vanished into limestone caves that honeycombed the island's northern highlands. With them went nurses, clerks, civilians, anyone who feared American capture more than jungle starvation. They became ghosts, living on raw vegetation, insects, whatever they could scavenge, slowly dying in the darkness while American forces controlled the island's roads, airfields, everything that mattered strategically. The war raged on for 14 more months above them. They heard planes overhead, felt distant explosions, but received no word from the outside world. One of those ghosts was a young nurse named Yoko Tanaka, 22 years old, trained at a military hospital in Tokyo, assigned to Saipan in 1943, when the island still seemed safe. When the Americans invaded in June 1944, her field hospital retreated inland. As positions collapsed, the order came: fall back to the caves, bring medical supplies, prepare for a long holdout. She obeyed. She had been trained to obey. For 14 months, Yoko lived underground with 36 other women and a small unit of soldiers led by officers who refused to believe the war could end in defeat. The rice ran out in October 1944. Medical supplies lasted until December. By early 1945, they were eating palm fronds and tree bark. Wounds became infected and stayed infected. Dysentery spread through their ranks like wildfire. 2 women died in March, another in June. The officers held small ceremonies praising their sacrifice for the emperor. Yoko watched her friends disappear into shallow graves and wondered when her turn would come. She had weighed 52 kilograms when she entered the cave. By September 1945, she weighed 38. Then August 15th arrived somewhere far away. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio waves, telling his nation the war had ended, that the unendurable must be endured, that surrender was now reality. The broadcast never reached Yoko's cave. She knew nothing of Hiroshima, nothing of Nagasaki, nothing of the mushroom clouds that had rewritten history's rules. She only knew hunger, darkness, the sound of her own breathing and stale air. Above ground, the world had changed completely. Below ground, time had stopped in 1944. American forces on Saipan, new holdouts remained in the jungle. Periodic patrols ventured into the interior, attempting to flush out stragglers. Loudspeakers broadcast surrender offers in Japanese. Leaflets fluttered down from planes explaining the war's end, promising good treatment. Some holdouts believed, most did not. Decades of propaganda could not be erased by paper promises. The leaflets that reached Yoko's cave were burned by the officers as enemy deception. Any woman who suggested surrender was silenced immediately. By September, Yoko's group faced a crisis. Food was gone. Water sources had dried up. Disease had claimed 7 women. The remaining survivors were living skeletons, hollow-eyed and skeletal. The officers called a meeting. Their decision was final surrender was impossible. It would disgrace the emperor, dishonor their families, violate everything they had sworn to uphold. 2 options remained: mass suicide by jumping from a cliff, or mass suicide by remaining in the cave until starvation completed its work. The debate stretched through the night while the women sat in silence, listening to men discuss their deaths, as if planning a training exercise. That's when Yoko made her decision. She whispered to the woman next to her, an older nurse named Fumiko, who had been a teacher before the war. Yoko said 3 words that changed everything. "I want to live." Fumiko's eyes widened in the darkness. She said nothing for several minutes. Then she squeezed Yoko's hand. "So do I." The decision spread through the women like electricity, quiet, dangerous, revolutionary. They wanted to live. They did not want to jump from cliffs or die in caves or become footnotes in someone else's definition of honor. They wanted the most basic thing humans have always wanted: survival. September 12th arrived gray and humid. Mist clung to the jungle canopy. The officers made their final announcement tomorrow morning. They would lead the women to Marpi Point, where everyone would jump together, honorable and united and eternal. The women nodded. They bowed. They gave every appearance of obedience. And that night they whispered their plan. When dawn came and the march began, they would run, not toward the cliffs, but toward the American perimeter they had seen from distant hilltops, toward the enemy, toward life. Dawn broke with the sound of officers barking orders. The group assembled for the march to the cliffs. Then Yoko ran. She just ran, straight toward where she knew Americans patrolled, toward the enemy she had been taught to fear more than death itself. 36 other women followed. Behind them, chaos erupted. The officers realized what was happening. They shouted orders. When orders failed, they raised their rifles. These women were deserters, traitors. They had chosen dishonor. The Japanese military code offered only one response. Bullets tore through the jungle. One round grazed Fumiko's arm. Another hit a tree inches from Yoko's head. But fear of the rifles behind them proved weaker than hunger for life ahead of them. They ran through undergrowth that tore their skin. They ran on feet wrapped in rags, on legs that had forgotten what strength felt like. They ran toward the barbed wire perimeter, toward the enemy that propaganda had painted as demons. They ran because running was their only choice left. And that's when Corporal James Williams saw them. Williams was 19 years old, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He had landed on Saipan during the invasion's second wave in June 1944. He had seen the worst of the combat, the banzai charges, the civilian suicides, the cave-clearing operations where flamethrowers did terrible work. He carried those images like scars. Now he stood at his post watching women run toward him while Japanese soldiers shot at them from behind. Every instinct told him to fire. Every tactical consideration screamed threat. But something deeper overrode his training. These were not soldiers. These were desperate people seeking help. Their clothing was torn rags. Their movements were stumbling, exhausted. Behind them, armed men were trying to kill them. Williams made his choice in half a heartbeat. Don't shoot. They're women. The other sentries lowered their weapons. Sergeant Miller ran to open the gate. 37 women poured through the wire, collapsing inside the American perimeter. Some fell to their knees. Others lay flat on the ground, unable to move further. All of them expected death. All of them had been promised that capture meant torture. Williams approached slowly, hands visible, voice calm. He spoke no Japanese. They spoke no English. But some communication transcends language. He unslung his canteen and offered water. Not as a weapon or tool, just water, cool, clean, life itself. Yoko took the canteen with shaking hands. She drank. Nothing happened. No trick, no trap, just water. She looked up at this young American soldier, this enemy, and saw no hatred in his eyes. Only concern. Within minutes, Camp Baker's medical staff arrived. Navy corpsmen began triage. Lieutenant Commander William Hayes personally examined each woman. What he found horrified him. Every single woman was severely malnourished with body weights between 35 and 42 kilograms. Infections covered their skin. Their feet were torn and bloody from 14 months of jungle living. Several had broken bones that had healed incorrectly. All showed signs of severe trauma, physical and psychological. Hayes ordered immediate treatment food, water, clean clothing, medical care. The women were moved to the camp hospital, a large tent with cots and supplies. They watched everything with wide eyes, waiting for cruelty that never came. Instead, corpsmen cleaned their wounds gently. Nurses provided fresh clothes. The mess sergeant prepared rice-familiar food that their stomachs could handle after months of starvation. When the meal arrived, the women could not believe it. White rice, real fish, vegetables, bread, tea. Portions were small to prevent refeeding syndrome, but the food was real and warm and given freely. Yoko took her first bite and the tears came. She had not cried when friends died. She had not cried during the escape. But this simple act of receiving food without violence broke something inside her, or maybe it healed something. Around her, other women wept too. They had run toward death expecting mercy, and they had found it. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything they had been taught was wrong. The Americans were not demons. They were young men offering water and medical care and kindness. The transformation happened slowly over the following weeks. The Americans could have treated these women as enemy prisoners under minimal Geneva Convention standards. Instead, they treated them as humans needing help. Clean tents with real cots and mosquito netting. Medical care that continued for weeks as infections healed and weight returned. 3 meals daily, carefully calibrated to restore health without shocking starved systems. Respectful guards who maintained security without intimidation or cruelty. Small gestures that accumulated into something larger than policy-simple human decency. Lieutenant Robert Chun became crucial to this transformation. A Japanese-American interpreter from Sacramento, California, his own family had been interned during the war at Tule Lake, yet he had volunteered to serve, to prove his loyalty, to fight for a country that had imprisoned him based on ancestry alone. He understood both cultures, both languages, both the pain of being seen as enemy regardless of your choices. Chun spent hours with the women, explaining the war's end, translating their questions, helping American personnel understand the depth of propaganda these women had survived. They had been taught that Americans were subhuman monsters who would rape and torture prisoners. Now they were receiving medical care, food, dignity. The dissonance forced deep reflection. Corpsman Danny Walsh found himself treating wounds while trying to understand what these women had endured. He was 20 years old, from South Boston. He had lost friends at Iwo Jima. He had every reason to hate the enemy. But watching a young woman flinch when he approached to clean her infected feet, watching her slowly realize he meant no harm, watching gratitude replace terror in her eyes, it complicated everything he thought he knew about this war. The women began to heal. Bodies filled out as regular meals restored weight and strength. Infections cleared under antibiotics that their own military had never provided. Hair grew back healthy and strong, but the deeper healing took longer. Some women refused to believe the kindness would continue. They waited for punishment, for cruelty, for the other shoe to drop. It never did. Days turned into weeks, and the Americans remained consistently, frustratingly kind. One evening in late October, Mess Sergeant Vincent Rossi prepared a special meal. He had learned through Lieutenant Chun that several women were from Tokyo. He made an effort to cook dishes they might recognize, nothing fancy, just rice balls shaped properly, miso soup made from available ingredients, pickled vegetables. When the women saw the meal, several cried. Rossi stood awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Lieutenant Chun translated the women's thanks. Rossi shrugged, embarrassed. "Just food, sir." Figured they'd like something from home. But it was not just food. It was recognition that these women had homes, families, lives beyond being enemy prisoners. It was acknowledgment of their humanity. And in war, that acknowledgment becomes revolutionary. Sergeant Rossi, a tough combat veteran from Brooklyn who had fought through Tarawa and Saipan, had done something more powerful than any tactical victory. He had seen the enemy as human beings worthy of comfort. That simple act embodied everything the Japanese officers had said Americans would never do. The women stayed at Camp Baker for several months. During that time, they were allowed to write letters home through Red Cross channels. Responses came slowly through the devastated Japanese postal system. When they arrived, the letters told stories of unimaginable devastation. Tokyo burned to ash, cities destroyed, families living in rubble, food scarce everywhere. Yoko's letter said her father had died in the March 1945 firebombing. Her mother was alive but barely surviving on rations that barely sustained life. The contrast became unbearable. Yoko sat in a comfortable American camp, eating 3 meals daily, sleeping on a real cot under mosquito netting, while her mother ate watery soup in Tokyo's ruins. The guilt crushed her. But it also taught her something profound about the nature of war. Her own military had been willing to kill her rather than let her survive. The enemy military had fed her instead. The Empire had valued her death more than her life. The Americans had valued her life more than her death. That inversion haunted her. In February 1946, repatriation orders came. The women would return to Japan. They prepared with mixed emotions, joy at returning home, fear of what home had become, uncertainty about how they would be received. Surrender carried shame in Japanese culture. Even after the emperor's surrender, these women had not only survived, they had actively chosen survival over death. That choice might be seen as cowardice. They did not know what awaited them. Before they left, the Americans gave each woman supplies food, medicine, clothing, money, small things that would help them survive the first weeks home. Corman Walsh gave his own jacket to one of the younger women. She protested. He insisted. "Where you're going, you need it more than I do." Sergeant Rossi packed extra food rations. Lieutenant Hayes ensured every woman received final medical clearances and medicines they might need. The farewell was strange Americans and Japanese, former enemies, exchanging goodbyes that felt genuine. Williams, the corporal who had shouted for his men not to shoot, shook Yoko's hand. Through Chun's translation, he said, "You're one of the bravest people I've met." Yoko did not feel brave. She felt broken and confused and guilty. But she thanked him, and she meant it. This young man from Iowa had given her life twice, once by not shooting, once by showing her that enemies could be kind. She would carry that knowledge forever. The ship carrying Yoko home was crowded with repatriated Japanese soldiers, sailors, prisoners returning to a homeland that now existed only in memory. Japan was defeated, its cities ash. When she reached Yokohama in March 1946, she found her mother living in a shack of salvaged wood. They held each other and cried. Her mother kept saying, "I thought you were dead." Yoko tried to explain what had happened: the water, the food, the medical care, the jacket Corman Walsh had given her, even though it contradicted years of propaganda. Her mother whispered, "They treated you better than our own officers." It was true, and almost unbearable. She never spoke publicly about Camp Baker. Stigma silenced former prisoners, so she rebuilt her life quietly and became a teacher. When students asked about Americans, she planted small truths. Wars are fought by governments, but survived by people. Enemies are people, too. Years later, she told her daughter everything: the cave, the terror, the mercy. When asked why she kept silent, Yoko said people preferred simple stories, not complicated truths about enemies showing humanity. She kept Walsh's faded jacket as proof that compassion can survive even war. Corporal Williams returned to Iowa and rarely mentioned the war. Late in life, he said his proudest moment was stopping his men from shooting the women. They just looked like people who needed help. The story of those 37 women has no heroic battles, only the reminder that individuals can choose mercy despite propaganda and fear. The Marines at Camp Baker shared food, treated wounds, and recognized common humanity. Camp Baker is gone, but the choice made that morning endures, the choice to lower weapons and open a gate. Yoko Tanaka lived until 1998, teaching her grandchildren the lesson she carried all her life. People are not their governments, and enemies are people too.